Okay, we got it.
Got it.
And he always wanted to be a writer. And he first went to the newspaper?
Yeah.
And went to the newspaper, and you were with him, what, 40 years?
42, I guess.
42 years. And what we really enjoyed about John was that he wrote a weekly column that made light of the week's events and how his family interacted. And it was always fun, a good story. So everybody in the community was looking forward to their Sunday papers so they could read John's column. Well, he also wrote some books. Several of them focus on Purdue University, and others focus on our space program. And he is not only an authority on the growth of our space program, but actually a friend of the astronauts that were Purdue alums. And by the way, there are 27 Purdue alums in the space group as astronauts. There are probably many more in NASA, wouldn't you say?
Oh, hundreds.
Hundreds in the NASA, because our aeronautical engineering school is extraordinarily good. Anyway, John and Gene, his wife, have traveled with us, or they've taken us along. And it's always nice to go someplace with John because he likes to drive and I don't. So he's driven us through northern and southern France. And we didn't drive in Italy, did we?
No.
But we had some experiences driving. He's a very dependable person, a very good friend, and a very good person to travel with. I don't know. I can't say enough good about him. He does speech writing. Several company CEOs asked him to write speeches for him, and he wrote speeches for 3 presidents at Purdue.
Yeah,
3 presidents at Purdue. Well, anyway, and he's really good natured. What else can I say? My wife is telling me to wrap it up. Okay, you've heard it. This is done.
Well, thank you, Steve. You know, LBJ had a good line when he was introduced and people said something nice about him. He said, well, you know, thank you so much for that introduction. He said, I wish my parents had been alive to hear that. He said, my father would have gotten a good laugh out of it and my mother would have believed it. So that's about how it goes. So I'm very happy to be here today to talk to you. I'm excited to talk about the space program. Usually when I start talking about the space program, you know, 90 minutes later, I'm still talking about it, you know, and people are running from the room. So it's an exciting thing to me to talk about. Mentioned Purdue engineers and science people in NASA. NASA is a very small part of the space program. NASA is a small operation. NASA partners with all these private partners, all the aeronautical people, all the space people. And when we've all seen mission control during these space launches. That's mostly people from private industry who are there. And the shuttle was almost entirely done by a private corporation that they'd set up. It was a unification of several different private organizations. So right now, NASA's at an exciting moment. You know, this is an exciting time for them. You've seen trying to get this Artemis rocket launched. It's twice been delayed, once by a hurricane. You can't blame them for that. And these kind of delays aren't unusual. They're trying now to get it up in mid-August. If they can get this thing up, and if it successfully circles the moon and comes back, they will put 4 astronauts in a capsule and send them to the moon. And so, you know, we're that close to doing that. So it's a really exciting time. And I always talk to some people today, who thought by this time we could have had settlements on the moon. We could have had all kinds of things, but we kind of gave up on the moon in 1972. And by we, I mean all the people of the United States. We didn't want to spend the money for it anymore, and the politicians were fine to go ahead and just do whatever they wanted to do. So I'll get going here a little bit and talk about a few things. I know I'm here at a place where, please interrupt me. I grew up with a brother and sister. I was interrupted most of the time I tried to say anything at the dinner table. So just jump right in. And you might have more to contribute. You might have questions. If I can answer the question, I'll answer it. If I can't answer the question, I promise you I'll make something up that really sounds pretty good. And maybe I can get away with it. You never know, especially with history, who can remember? Your area here has a great history in the space program with the White Sands here and the military bases. It's just a really important, significant area in all that's happened in space. A couple things I wanted to mention, near Holloman Field, just north of there, in 1948, there was this test pilot named Joseph Kittinger. Do you know about his story? Mm-mm. Well, they wanted to test what would happen in the X-15 if they had problems with the X-15 or other planes flying way up high on the edge of space, and actually, enormous speeds. What would happen if those guys tried to bail out at those levels? So they sent this guy, Joseph Kittinger. They put him up in a balloon, and he drifted up into the air over Holloman, or that area over there, until he got to 102,800 feet, which I looked it up, and that's about 19 miles. So imagine going 19 miles high into the air. And he was in a gondola underneath a balloon, and it had a little door on it, and he opened the door and he jumped out from 19 miles high. For a little bit, he passed out. For a little bit, he had parachutes wrapped around his neck and was able to get that out. He dropped for 13 minutes and 45 seconds. His body reached 614 miles per hour. And that is 90% of the speed of sound. And he landed. And he got up and walked away. The people couldn't believe it. They took him to the hospital anyway, figured he probably just didn't know how badly he was injured. But it was a successful test. And he not only survived that jump in 1948, he still survives. He's 94 years old. Wow. And he lives in Florida. And he's still with us, and how he was with us after that jump is beyond me. But it was important to how they would get the early flyers and the X-15 and the Bell X, which were the experimental aircraft of that time. If they had to bail out at those speeds and at that height, how would they do it? Well, by doing this test, they did it. Neil Armstrong was a friend of Kittinger's. They were both test pilots. And I tried to think about, I talked to Neil about this particular incident, and I think the word he used for what Kittinger did was crazy. Neil was fine flying to the moon, but he would not jump out of a gondola beneath a balloon from 19 miles high. So that's an exciting story about what happened here. And another story that I've had for a number of years that I have a lot of fun with, and you probably heard of this or know something about it. After World War II, we were very interested in the Russians, as we are today. And we wanted to know when they were going to develop an atomic bomb. And how do you do that? How can they figure out when the Russians are going to set off an atomic bomb, or how their tests are going? Well, if you send listening devices up into the stratosphere, they could pick up the sounds and know what was going on. So they launched these balloons. And before the war, balloon technology, they were doing a lot of high things with balloons. But during the war, they developed a lot of new materials. 3M in Minnesota got involved. And a lot of things happened in balloon technology that were just stalled during the war, but they advanced it. So they had new types of balloons they were sending up. and they had equipment that people had never seen before to listen for these things that were flying, sent into space. And they sent balloons into space and listened for the Russians. And this wasn't unusual. The Russians did send balloons over, the Japanese sent balloons over the United States during World War II to spy on us, and in fact dropped some bombs from balloons, but they only landed in wooded areas and caused some minor fires. So anyway, we were doing this, and there was a man named Charles B. Moore, and he would later become a professor, and now professor emeritus, and sadly he's passed since all this, at New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology, which I think you call New Mexico Tech. And he was a brilliant person. He was involved in this project of developing balloons that would go up to the stratosphere and listen for the Russian, what the Russians were doing. It was called Project Mogul. It was so secret that Moore, who was in charge of it, didn't even know the name of the project. They never told him. They kept that a secret from them. And they launched some from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. They launched some from North Dakota. But on June 4th, 1947, about a year before Kittinger jumped out of a balloon at 19 miles, they launched 28 balloons connected to one another in a train with all kinds of sophisticated listening devices underneath, electronics, and it was new things that there was reflective material they put in these things, all kinds of different things. Well, things didn't go well, as sometimes they don't when you try and launch things up to the stratosphere. And the balloons ended up landing outside of Roswell, New Mexico. They had been launched right here from Holloman, and they didn't get any farther than Roswell, where they came down. Well, it wasn't until 1994 that Moore found out that his balloons that he had launched from Alamogordo were actually the things that the people in Roswell were claiming were the alien space invaders. And he actually went there and he examined the material. He said, "Yes, this is the balloons that I launched, from a short distance away." And when I interviewed him, he wrote a book about this. And so it wasn't any secret. I mean, he told people, well, yes. And the Air Force did a study on it. And they said, yes, this was material that we were launching into space to spy on the Russians. But I said, a lot of people still believe that the Roswell has the aliens that landed there. I said, isn't it aggravating to you that people believe the story and not the truth? Which may be the way of the world today. I don't know. But at that time, I wondered if it bothered him. Oh, no, I don't mind that at all. He said, actually, the aliens is a much better story than mine. And besides that, he believed in aliens anyway. And so he just wasn't bothered by it. But he was quite a person. And it's just a little piece of all the significant things that happened and interesting things that happened here, especially in the early days of space. But White Sands did a lot of testing for the Apollo program. And as I look at y'all, it looks like a couple of us were born before 1957 when the space program got going, and can remember all this. But we had Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, and they did a lot of testing at White Sands on things that Apollo was going to do. Also, before I get going, I mentioned that that we're trying to get this rocket up. We, the United States, is trying to find to get return to the moon. And I said in my publicity that for this talk that I would mention that it's my hope and my feeling that it will be the next person to step on the moon will be a woman. And why do I think that? It's because no minorities and no women were involved in the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs. None, zero, zip. The first Hispanic astronaut was picked in 1980. He flew in 1986. The first African American was picked in 78. He flew in 1983. The first woman was picked in 1977. She flew in 1983. Her name was Sally Ride. I know we all remember her because she was the first woman the United States sent up. The Russians had already sent 2 women into space by this time, one of them into the early 60s. And by the way, an interesting sidelight on Sally Ride is they have a space shuttle had a little kitchen area where they all had their food, and they all picked out the food they wanted to eat, and they all took care of themselves. They all made it. Sally Ride refused to allow anyone to photograph her making food while she was on the space shuttle. And I think we all understand why. I don't think that was wrong of her. So what I'm trying to say here is that there was no, well, I will a little deeper here. You've heard of the Mercury 7. You've all heard of the Mercury 7. It was the first Mercury astronauts, 7 white guys that they picked to do the initial launches in space. Well, at the same time, they did that. This was after Sputnik in 57. It was in the late 60s. A private philanthropist started a program called the Mercury 13. And that was because they picked 13 women, and they put these women through the same tests and training that the Mercury 7 were going through. And they found out the women were equally qualified as the Mercury 7. They could pass all this stuff. They could do all these things that they needed to do. And in fact, they were a little better. And you know why? Because they were lighter, they were smaller, and every pound made a difference, especially in those Mercury flights. So the women, this group of women, 13 women, decided to appeal to be officially recognized and included in the space program. Well, what do you think happened? You know, they went to Lyndon Johnson, who was vice president in 62, and they appealed to him, and he wrote in the paper where they wrote a letter to him. He wrote at the top, he said, "Let's stop this now. Let's stop this idea of women going to space right now." They appealed to some of the astronauts. At this time, the other astronauts coming in, John Glenn testified before Congress, and he said, "Men go off and fight the wars and fly the planes, and women stay at home. It's a fact of our social order." And by the way, Senator John Glenn apologized for that profusely throughout his political career, saying he regretted having saying that. The point I'm making here is that minorities weren't picked for the space program, for the race into space, all through the 1960s and early 1970s. They weren't picked. But women were the only group that were specifically excluded. No one said no African Americans. No one said no Hispanics, but they did say no women. So it's my feeling that when we get the moon launches going again, that my hope is that a woman will be the first person to step out of that capsule and walk on the moon. The capsule will hold 4 people. There are 18 astronauts with NASA now in training to do this moonwalk. Just by coincidence, 9 of them are women and 9 are men. And there are also African Americans in the group and some Asian Americans. So I hope they have a nice, diverse group. I wondered what Neil Armstrong, I have so much to say, what Neil Armstrong would think about a Zoom talk. To my knowledge, he never did a Zoom talk. And Gene Cernan, and I know both these people very well from being a reporter and interviewing them, writing books that they're into, and also serving as a host for them at Purdue University. When they came to visit campus, they would be involved in speeches and dinners. And of course, when they got through, they were just mobbed by people just surrounded them. And the astronaut, they were fine with that. They understood. But there was a certain point when they maybe had enough. And so there are people like me who kept an eye on things. And when it was time to get them, it had reached a point to end it. The astronauts were uncomfortable saying, "Get away from me," So we would step in and say, "Get away from them." They're due someplace else. We have to take them someplace else. So we played bad guy. We walked them around. Neil Armstrong became very comfortable with me, taking me around campus. One time I knocked on his door at the Union Building, the Union Inn, and he opened the door just a crack, just about that much, and stuck his nose out. He said, "Oh, John, it's you." He said, "Come on in." And he opened the door, and there was the first man on the moon standing there in his boxers and nothing else, which was kind of a shock to me. because the person that famous, and he said, "Oh, just sit down and I'll get dressed." And I said, "I'll wait outside, Neil." But anyway, Neil would not have been comfortable with a Zoom talk. And I'm going to tell you a little bit why. We named a building after Neil Armstrong on campus, an engineering building, Neil Armstrong Hall of Engineering. He didn't pay for it. He really didn't even want it. A bunch of alums gave a bunch of money for a building if they would name it after Neil Armstrong. And they had to go plead with him. Please let us name this building after you. And he finally said, okay. So he came to the dedication. They put a statue of him as he looked, as he was when he was a student, out in front of the building. He refused to come to the dedication of the statue because he said that he felt that would be arrogant to be there at the dedication of a statue to himself. So he wouldn't come to that, but he would come for the dedication of the building. So they sent me, he flew in on a great big jet, a Bridgestone tire jet. And we don't have a commercial airport there. We do have an airport right on campus. And he landed and he got off the plane. He had family and friends with him. There was a whole entourage. And I had the Purdue cars out on the tarmac. And he came up to me and he said, "John, take my family, my wife Carol and my sons and others to the Union Inn. I'm going back in the airplane." So he turned around, headed back to the airplane. And I said, "Well, Neil, don't forget we have a dinner at 6 o'clock and you're supposed to be there because you're the guest of honor." And he said, "Don't worry, I'll be back." No problem. So he went and he got in his airplane and flew away. And I thought maybe he was going to go have some fun, go fly in the airplane. I didn't know, but he was in the car and his wife Carol was seated next to me. And I just asked her, I said, "What's he doing? Is he just going to fly around and have some fun or what's going on?" She says, "No," she says, he actually forgot his speech back in Ohio. So if you're Neil Armstrong and you're in Lafayette, you forgot your speech back home on the coffee table by the front door, you fly back to Cincinnati, land at a private airport, go home, pick it up and fly back, and you'll still be there in plenty of time. So that's what he was doing. I said, "Well, maybe we can," she said, "Oh no," Carol said, "Oh no, the keys to his car are in his suitcase." This is something I do sometimes, but it's not a good idea. The keys to his car are in his suitcase. He's going to get to the private airport, won't be able to get in the car, drive home and get the speech. So I said, "Well, let's go out to the gate." There was a gate there and we got out and the plane was beginning to pull away from the gate. And we said, "We need to talk to them." And he said, the person at the gate there said, "I'm sorry, no one can talk to them except for the person in the tower, and they won't do it. I promise you they won't do it." So, I said to Carol, I said, "Well, the plane is right there. I mean, Neil's right there. Call him on his cell phone." Yeah. And she looked at me and she said, "What is the right pronunciation of the word?" She said, "The man is a Luddite. He refuses to carry a cell phone." And Neil and Gene Cernan both often talked about that. They would say, "You people in the audience here, you have more computer power in your pockets and in your purse than we had in the lunar module when we landed on the moon. You have more power and more computer capabilities on your phone than we had." The moon landing was done by slide rules and really smart people. At any rate, Neil, throughout his life, never did carry a cell phone. He maintained that. I saw his son. Neil died in 2012, and we can talk about that if you want. But I saw his son several years after that, and I said, "Did he ever carry a cell phone?" And he said, "No. We gave him that one at Christmas one time. It never was taken out of the box." So I don't think Neil would have been too interested in Zooms. Gene Cernan, on the other hand, was a classic jet pilot. Everything you think of as a military jet pilot, what are these guys called? You've seen the movies of them and everything. What again? Hotshot. Yeah, he would. Neil would have loved anything that had the word Zoom in it because that's what he loved, zooming around in the jet. I mean, Gene. So anyway.
So how did he get his speech?
How did he get his speech? Well, he did fly back and pick it up and got it. And I went back to there and got him to the banquet in time. and probably would have delayed it a few minutes if he was a little late, but he got there in time.
But how did it happen? He didn't have his keys to the car.
Well, he must have had another way to get in. Maybe he had a spare set. No, no.
No, okay.
But at any rate, he did have a speech, and the next day, he had to go to the football game, and he had to give a speech as dedication. And I met him before the talk of the dedication, and he said, "I forgot my speech back at the hotel." And I said, "Don't." I forgot my speech back at the hotel. I said, "Don't worry, Neil. We have that speech. You sent it to us. It's in a booklet on the podium. No problem." And he said, "But I forgot my tickets to the football stadium." And I said, "Neil, I don't think we're going to have a lot of problems getting Neil Armstrong into the Purdue University football stadium, tickets or no tickets." And we didn't. And he also, his son came in without a tie that Friday evening. And he asked me to take his son out and help him take him to some store where he could buy a tie to wear to the banquet that night. And his side comment, later on, I told him I had gotten his son a place where he could buy a tie. And Neil said to me, "Well, he lives in California. So he figured people in California would never wear a tie." So I'm going to get into this a little bit because there's so much I have there. But I want to take you back. Go back with me a little bit, okay? Let's go back to 1900, the year 1900. This is a new century, a new time. People argue, was it 1901, 1900? Well, we're doing 1900. It's an exciting time. A lot of things are happening. The president of Purdue at that time was a guy named Winthrop Stone, and he was not a tall guy, but he stood straight, and people thought he was taller than he was. And his hair was turning white, and he was really a brilliant person. Actually, he was at that time the vice president of Purdue. He'd be named the president in 2 months. At that time, he had a PhD in chemistry, which he had earned in Germany. And at that time, people at universities, it wasn't common to have a PhD, not by presidents, not by faculty. That would come much later. So a really brilliant man and a very distinguished person. And he went to a high school in Indiana, Anderson High School, to talk to the students in April of 1900. So he got up there to the podium and he gave his speech. And he talked about all the wonderful, miraculous things that had happened in the 19th century. And there were the steam engine, the locomotive, medical advances, all kinds of wonderful things happened in the 19th century. And that was his generation. That was his century. And he was there before these high school students bragging about what had been accomplished in the 1900s and 1800s. But that isn't what those students wanted to hear. Those students were getting ready for a brand new century, and it was their century. They were thinking about what was going to happen during their lifetimes, what exciting advancements in technology were going to happen that were going to change the world. As smart as Winthrop Stone was, as brilliant a person as he was, there was no way that he could comprehend, dream, or imagine that there were students in that audience in 1900 who were going to live to see a person walk on the moon, and that person would be a graduate of his university. That was beyond comprehension. In 1900, it just couldn't be done. In fact, when Neil Armstrong was on the Purdue campus, along with Gene Cernan and Gus Grissom and Roger Chaffee, most of the time for Chaffee, but all the time for the others, they never thought about going to the moon. Neil Armstrong didn't sit there sitting under trees on the Purdue campus and dream about being the first person to land on the moon. That wasn't even on his radar. He wanted to be a jet test pilot. That's what he wanted to be. That's what they all wanted to be. The whole moon landing thing came later. So I'm not an engineer. I'm not a scientist. What I am is I'm a storyteller. I tell stories. And when I was a boy, my mother would always say to me when I explained something that had happened, she said, "Are you telling me a story?" And that meant, "Are you lying to me?" But the stories I'm going to tell are hopefully true. But these are great stories. And although I'm not an engineer, I can't spell aeronautical. The story of flight, the story of space, is one of the most incredible stories in human history. It's absolutely amazing when you start looking at it. December 17th, 1903 late in the morning, Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, Orville and Wilbur Wright finally get their plane off the ground. They've been trying for quite a while. It goes up. We all say Orville had the first flight. That wasn't long enough for them. They flew several more times, and finally Wilbur actually flew it a long enough distance that they thought that, well, they'd accomplished flight. So what do you do if you accomplish something people have been trying to do for centuries and centuries and centuries? Well, if you're the Wright brothers, you stop and have lunch. And they did, and the wind caught their plane and damaged the wings, and they had to quit for the day, and they packed up and went home to Dayton, Ohio, where their father, who was a very conservative religious person, there would be no Christmas gifts at their house. It would all be religious, but they got home in time for Christmas. So December 17th, 1903, Kitty Hawk, okay? The lunar landing was on July 20th, 1969. It took less than 66 years to get from Kitty Hawk to the moon. I used to think 66 years was a long time, but I'm pushing 75 now, and I'm telling you that's a short period of time, but they did it. What an incredible accomplishment. Charles Lindbergh, we know what Charles Lindbergh, he was born in 1902, the year before the Wright brothers flew. Neil Armstrong was born in 1930. He was 38 years old when he walked on the moon. Charles Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic in 1927, 3 years before Neil was born. Orville Wright knew Lindbergh. Wilbur had died of typhoid in 1912. Orville Wright knew Lindbergh. Lindbergh knew Neil Armstrong. They knew each other pretty well. Lindbergh died in 1974. Lindbergh lived to see the entire Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs. He lived to see all the moon landings. I interviewed a woman once. She was the widow of a man named Ivan Kinchlow. He's a Purdue graduate. He was the first person to be called a spaceman because of his flights on the Bell X-2. And he got so high and so fast that they called him a spaceman. And he crashed and died. But the astronauts all loved him. He was really the model that they used for how they would conduct themselves. These very calm, straightforward answers, very militaristic sometimes, yes, sir, yes, ma'am. And she showed me a picture of her at a dinner, and she was sitting there at a round table. Everybody was dressed up to these tuxedos or dressed military uniforms. And on the right side of her was Neil Armstrong. And on the left side of her was Charles Lindbergh. And I said, that must have been an interesting evening. She says, yes, it definitely was. So Neil lived to see the entire US shuttle program from 1972, when Nixon started the shuttle program, until it ended in 2011. 135 missions, 55 astronauts, many carried multiple times. It's been a very short thing that we've gone a long way in flight and space in a very short period of time. About 600 people have flown in space. It's very tricky to tell how many NASA astronauts, but it's somewhere around 350. And you all remember when this got started, when Sputnik went up in 57, they started talking about space. And the first astronauts they picked, the Mercury 7, were all military people. They were all test pilots. They were all military. Eisenhower saw the space program as something military. That's what he was interested in, the military aspects of it. He wasn't interested in civilians. So Neil Armstrong was not among the Mercury 7. He was among the second group picked. On April 12th, 1961, and I can remember this because it was my birthday, Yuri Gagarin, first Russian, flew into space. We were right behind him. On May 5th, Alan Shepard flew in 1961, and then Gus Grissom shortly after that. I want to go over a couple other things. On May 25th, you all remember this speech, or you've heard about it since. Kennedy spoke to a joint session of Congress right after the Shepard flight. And he said, I believe this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. And believe me, our astronauts have all been very concerned about that, return him safely to Earth part of that speech. People forget about it, but that was important. But Kennedy said a lot more that day. He went on and he said, this is going to be tremendously expensive. This is going to cost a lot of money. We're going to have to divert money from something into this to make this work. Don't do it unless you're willing to do that. This is going to take a lot of brain power. We're going to have to divert are brilliant people from one thing and have them work on the space program. And Kennedy ended his speech by saying, in a very real sense, it will not be one man. It will not be one man going to the moon if we make this judgment. It will be an entire nation, for all of us must work to put him there. All of us. NASA opposed the speech. They said they couldn't do it. Whatever you think of Kennedy, he understood politics, he understood people, he understood if they were going to do something like this, they needed to have a vision, a great vision, and it had to be a moon landing. It couldn't be something, that wasn't so inspirational. So they went with the moon landing. But Neil Armstrong always said, I was just the guy on the top of the rocket. There were thousands of people who were working on this thing, who were just as involved and even more important than I was. He never wanted to take solo credit. I was the first man in the moon. Never. Always avoided that. He said there were many, many people involved in this. And Kennedy had said that long before him. So he was picking up somewhat what Kennedy said, but he was just that kind of a guy. The space program inspired a generation. It caused investments to go into education. We started putting more efforts into science and technology in junior high and high schools, and it resulted in it changed America. It changed the world. There was when Neil Armstrong was landing on the moon, you might have heard stories about they were very close to landing and they were running out of fuel, and all of a sudden these alarms start going off in the lunar module, and Neil says, a 1202 alarm, 1202 alarm. What does that mean? And back at Mission Control, there was a guy named Jack Garman. He was 24 years old, and a 1202 alarm was his alarm. And basically, it was put in the simplest terms, it was the computers on the lunar module saying, I'm getting too much information, I'm going to sleep, which I feel like sometimes myself. So this 24-year-old guy sitting in Mission Control had seconds. I mean, they said to him, is it go or no go? Is it go or no go? And he said, go. And he was right. He was right because he had rehearsed, he had practiced, and he knew that the distance between the alarms was long enough that it was a faulty alarm and it wasn't the computers shutting down. So an amazing change in people and in our educational system. This is a guy he was educated thanks to the space program. The average age of engineers in mission control when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, any guesses? 28 years old. That was the average age of those people in mission control. Neil Armstrong was chosen for the space program in '62. I got to know Neil and Gene, as I mentioned to you, on the Purdue campus and through interviews with them. The last time I was with them, both of them together. It had been at a program at Purdue, and they had been it was a banquet, but they didn't get a chance to eat. So they wanted to go out for pizza afterwards. So we sat at a popular pizza restaurant in Lafayette with a glass of beer and wine and eating pizza with the first and last person to walk on the moon. And that was, a couple others were there too. It was kind of a special evening for those of us who were there. People always ask me, what did they talk about? Did they talk about launching into space? Did they talk about walking on the moon, climbing down the ladder of the lunar module? They didn't talk about any of that. You know what they talked about? They talked about their kids and their grandkids and their friends. These are two guys who had known each other at Purdue in the 1950s and had been best of friends since the early 1960s. And they didn't want to talk about going to the moon. They want to talk about things going on in their life right now. So the moon landing wasn't ever mentioned. And when we walked out of the pizza place that night, there was a full moon, a great big full moon. And Neil looked up at it. And I was invited to the 10th anniversary of Neil's press conference for celebrating the 10th anniversary of the moon landing. And he was asked at that time, did he ever look at the moon? Did he ever look up it and think about it? It was a very small press conference, only about 25 people. It was all people that I knew because they were all network people covering science and technology and space, or people with AP and UPI. I was invited because I had asked for an interview on the 10th anniversary, and because I was from the hometown paper of Purdue. It had nothing to do with me. But anyway, he was asked, do you ever look up at the moon? And he said, well, yes. He said, sometimes I do go out at night and I look up at a full moon and I can see a place where I've been. How would you like to be able to do that? Look out at the moon tonight and see a place where you had been. Neil was born, somebody want to say something?
I think
John?
David.
Yes?
Hey, John, you mentioned seeing place where you'd been. Did you interview Armstrong or Cernan or other astronauts before they went to the moon and then interviewed them after they went to the moon and see what their thoughts were about the Earth?
After, I'm not that old. So
Well,
I became a journalist in 71, moved to Lafayette in 72. And of course, Cernan's walk on the moon, the last one was in 72. So my contact with him was after all this had happened to them.
Oh, okay.
A little back, go ahead.
but I just thought maybe, there would have been a comment about saying, it seemed to be one of the images that's always stuck in my mind is a picture, I think, taken from either one of the rockets going to the moon or somewhere up there where you saw the Earth as a distant object, partly lighted. And it just seemed to me that you would have a different perspective on what Earth is if you'd seen that.
They do. And I'll try and get into that a little bit
Okay, sorry.
later on. But one of the shots you'll probably talk about was taken on Apollo 9, which actually went to the moon, circled around, and came back. Didn't do anything else. That was pretty spectacular. And the first picture of the Earth from space. Think of it, we remember this. We remember seeing this. It's the first time we'd ever seen the Earth. We'd seen what we looked like. It's like the first time we looked in a mirror. And it was beautiful. It was really beautiful. And you could see how fragile it was. And another photograph they sent back was the moon rising above the Earth in the background. No, they took a picture of the moon and the Earth was rising above it. So it was, called Earth rising. And they were just spectacular photos. So a little background on Neil. He was born in Wapakoneta, Ohio. His father was an auditor for the state of Ohio. He audited counties. Neil moved 16 times in 14 years. 16 times in 14 years. So I think that had an effect on him through his life. The family finally settled in Wapakoneta. He had an airplane license at 16. He got an airplane license before he got a license to drive a car. And in those days, you could drive a car pretty easily whenever you wanted to. He decided that he wanted to be a jet pilot, to be an engineer. He talked about going to MIT and become an MIT engineer, and MIT wanted him. But in 1946, he went to a football game in Columbus, Ohio, and Purdue University was coming in. And of course, they expected Ohio State to absolutely kill Purdue University because they almost always do. But on that day, Ohio State didn't score a first down, I don't think, until the third quarter. Purdue beat Ohio State easily, and the people of Ohio were stunned. And Neil Armstrong sat there, and he was in the stadium. He watched the game, and he told me this story himself. This sounds crazy. He loved football, and he was sitting there looking at the field and what had happened. And he said, I love football. MIT football, not so hot. Purdue football, that looks pretty good, And that Purdue is only a short drive away from Wapakoneta. Maybe I should go to Purdue. And an uncle encouraged him to go to Purdue. Said, go to Purdue. It's close by. You'll like being there. Anyway, he did choose to come to Purdue, and he came there in 1947. I think I mentioned he was 17 years old when he showed up on campus, and the campus was full of ex-GIs there on the GI Bill. They were, 25, even 30 years old. And here was Neil, this young guy of 17. He just turned 17 because he'd skipped a grade. And he always talked about that statue they put of him on campus. He said, only Purdue would put a statue of a scared freshman in front of an engineering building because he was scared. He was scared of his fellow students. He was scared of the professors. He was afraid of everything going on in engineering. He always talked about one of the experiences at Purdue when he first got there. He said the professor asked him to talk about Bernoulli's law. The homework assignment was to discuss Bernoulli's law. Maybe some of you know more about this than I do, but I've looked it up, and it helps explain how an aircraft can achieve lift because of the shape of its wings. But Neil said, the professor said that they wanted us to talk about this Bernoulli's principle, Bernoulli's law, and he wanted us to criticize it. Well, how do you criticize something that's established law of nature? How are you going to do that? But he said later on, he realized that that's what they were trying to do at Purdue. They weren't trying to teach them things that they could repeat back. They were trying to teach them to think. And he said that made all the difference in his life. Between 1946 and 1957, on the Purdue University campus were Gus Grissom, the second Mercury pilot, the first Gemini pilot, the first Apollo 1 pilot, Neil Armstrong, we know he is, Gene Cernan, last man to walk on the moon, and Roger Chaffee, who died with Gus Grissom in Apollo 1. And as I said earlier, these people did not think about going to the moon. It wasn't on their wavelength. They wanted to be jet pilots. They wanted to be test pilots. Neil graduated in 55. He married a Purdue girl. They had 3 children. He wanted to go to Edwards Air Force Base. They didn't have a space for him. He applied to the NACA, which is called National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. They sent him to Cleveland and then to Edwards. And we know in 1978, the NACA was changed and became NASA. In California, Neil was involved in a program called, after Sputnik, it was a program called Man in Space Soonest. And it had the unfortunate acronym of MISS. Guess what? That was abandoned. And so that was a program that kind of preceded to Mercury. There was another program he was involved in called Dinosaur. And it looked very much like the shuttle program where they attached a rocket, a capsule on the side of a plane and a rocket and would take it up. And when NASA offered him a job with the Mercury in the program at Houston, Neil Armstrong didn't know which one to take. He said it was a little hesitant. I thought maybe Dinosaur would become the main one, but he went to NASA, and it was a good decision. It worked out well for him. In his first flight, Gemini 8, March of '66, he was on board with David Scott, was his second in command up there. Interesting, both have become moonwalkers. You know about this. That was the first time they docked 2 vehicles in space. They got them docked, and the thing started spinning out of control, just completely out of control. And these 2 guys sitting up there in space had no idea what to do. But they disengaged from what they hooked up to. That didn't do any good. They were still spinning in space. Pretty sharp guys. They were able to think their way through this, and there were no instructions. There was nothing mission control telling them what to do. They figured it out. They got the capsule steadied, and they had to come down and end their mission early. But I think that's one of the reasons Neil and Stafford ended up in the Apollo program, was because they were so cool. They didn't panic when things went so wrong. So it was a big deal for them. So on January 2nd, 1969, January 7th, Purdue went to the Rose Bowl. That doesn't happen very often. It's only happened twice. And the game was on January 2nd, because in those days, if January 1st fell on a Sunday, they wouldn't play a football game.
And
Times have
Susan
changed.
and I were there.
Times have changed. Then the Rose Bowl parade that year, we had a float. And on the float were Gus Grissom, Roger Chaffee, Neil Armstrong, and Gene Cernan, our 4 astronauts. That was on January 2nd, 1969. On January 27th, 1967, they had a testing of Apollo 1, and you know the story. 3 astronauts burned to death. It was horrible. And Ed White was the 3rd one. with Chaffee and Gus Grissom. Anyway, they stopped the program for a time, and they had to decide what to do. They redesigned the capsule, and which Gus Grissom said was junk. The last thing he said to his wife was he'd taken a lemon with him, and he said, "I'm going to hang this on the space capsule at NASA because it's a lemon. It's no good at all." So a few months later, after that horrible tragedy, in April of '67, Deke Slayton, who was in charge of assigning astronauts to missions, called together 17 astronauts, and he said, "The guys who are going to fly the first lunar mission are in this room." Okay, must have been an exciting moment for him, but he didn't tell them who was going to do it, and the reason he didn't tell them who was going to do it is because he didn't know. They were going to start with Apollo 7 and run through tests and see how far they could go on each mission. And whenever they felt they were at a point where they were ready to land on the moon, they would name a mission. And they did that on January 6th of 1969. Deke Slayton called the three guys on Apollo 11 in, and he said, "You're it. You're going to do it." And they hadn't even run some of the ones to go. You know, it's how fast they were going. Apollo 7 went in October of '68. Apollo 10 went in December. In January, they were doing another one. They just were doing them every 2 months or so. So Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong was not picked at any point to be the first person to land on the moon. It was just the way it worked out. It was just the way it worked out. He was in line. He was the commander of the mission that by happenstance was the one that was ready to go. The policy was at that point that the commander of the mission would be first out of the capsule. That was Neil. Buzz Aldrin didn't agree with that. Buzz Aldrin actually started a campaign to be the first person out of the lunar module and be the first person to walk on the moon. And he even confronted Neil with this and said, "I want to be the first person out." And Neil was not a confrontational person. He said, "Well, I'm not unaware that there is some significance to being first out of the capsule and walk on the moon, and I'm not ready at this time to relinquish that." And this went on for quite a while. And finally, the top people at NASA said, "Stop it. Neil's the first person out, and we don't want to hear anymore." So that's the way it was. But Neil, there was no X on Neil Armstrong's forehead saying, "That's the guy we want to be the first person to walk on the moon." In fact, if anybody who had that X on his forehead, it was Gus Grissom, who had died in '67. He was really the one they were looking at, if they were looking at anyone. But everyone at NASA, every astronaut I've ever talked to said that no one could have handled the experience of being the first person to walk on the moon as well as Neil Armstrong did. I asked, Neil Armstrong got on the moon. We know he walked out and he said, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." And people have been arguing ever since about whether he used an A in that first, and that, to me, that's just silly. He said, "Well, I thought I did, can't you just put it in there?" So they kind of put it in parentheses. When I went to Neil's 10th anniversary press conference in 1979, I asked him how he felt about that statement. First, one small step for a man. And he said, "Well, that wasn't the important thing I said that day." Well, and Neil, what was the important thing he said that day? He said, "The important thing I said was the eagle has landed."
Oh, yeah.
The eagle has landed. Neil felt there was a 50-50 chance that he could land that lunar module and then get it back up the next day. He thought there was only a 50-50 chance, but that was good enough for him. He felt good about that. And not long, within a year of that landing on the moon, the real landing on the moon, he was flying a test lunar module, and he crashed it. And he got out in the last second. He barely got out alive, but he had crashed it. He'd not been having good luck. And we know you probably remember that he was flying that thing, and he was looking for a place to land, and he couldn't find a place to land. And he ended up doing it with about 15 seconds of fuel left. But he always said, "Well, we all know in your car, it says empty. There's a few gallons left in there." Anyway.
Do you want to let them ask you some questions?
Any questions right now before I go on to Gene?
I got
Yes.
It's 5 minutes.
Oh, Susan, go ahead.
What,
Pardon? Go ahead.
Charlie, what?
Oh, okay. Quick question on these guys. I can't imagine somebody being that brave to be the first one and wanting to be so. And I've always been curious, did they carry any pills for suicide if they were not able to return?
Not that I know of. The only thing I can tell you along those lines is that when during the Gemini program, Cernan was supposed to do a spacewalk, and they called the guy he was flying with aside at the last minute and said, "Yeah, if something goes wrong in that spacewalk and you can't get him back in, you're gonna have to come back without him. You're gonna have to abandon him there in space." So it's possible they were doing that, but I honestly wouldn't make up answers. I don't know if they
Oh,
did or not. I'll just quickly do a little bit on Cernan. He was born in the Chicago area. He was a totally different person from Neil. He was a little more freewheeling. He had a Navy scholarship to go to college. He wanted to go to Purdue. They said Purdue was full. He had to go to Illinois. His father refused to let him go to Illinois. His father paid the bills for him to go to Purdue as an out-of-state student until an ROTC scholarship could open up for him there. He was an excellent student. He was a fun-loving guy. Martha Horn Chaffee, Roger Chaffee's wife. Roger Chaffee and Cernan were very close friends on the Purdue campus. They were one year apart. And Chaffee married a woman on campus named Martha Horn. She'd been a homecoming queen. She was a beautiful woman, still is. Anyway, Neil Gene was in charge of picking the queen of the military ball, the biggest dance of the year. And Martha told me, I went in and interviewed with Gene Cernan for that position, and he did not pick me. He did not pick me. And next time you see Gene Cernan, I want you to tell him I haven't forgotten that. And I did. He said, well, a woman never forgets. Neil graduated from Purdue in 1955, and 14 years after he graduated from Purdue and got his undergraduate degree, he walked on the moon. So I like to talk to students at universities now. What are you going to do 14 years after you graduate? Or what did you do 14 years after you graduated? Gene flew to the moon 16 years after he graduated. Gene was poetic. And just read you something here he said about what it was like being in space. He talked about, this is a quote, "The naked sun, an intense ball of gleaming white fire, stared at me, a tiny interloper in its realm. The view of the Earth was incredible from my treehouse in the galaxy as my home planet swished beneath my boots. The blue horizon had vanished at sunrise, and now was merely a tissue-thin, curved band of color terminating in black space. From up where I was, there was no weather. I looked down on the tops of thunderstorms and the giant cottony fingers of Hurricane Alma. In the open seas, I could make out V-shaped wakes of ships, and on land, dark grids of major cities. Mountain ranges spawned graceful rivers that slid toward the oceans, and I could see the Mississippi wiggling to New Orleans." He was just poetic. That you asked him. I asked Neil what it was like to walk on the moon. He sent me a description of technically how you walk on the moon. I asked the same question of Gene, and it was pure poetry. Just went on and on. I know I got at the end of this thing just a couple more stories, and I'm going to let you go. Gene went on Apollo 10. Apollo 10 did everything Apollo 11 did except land on the moon. Gene got in the lunar module, went away from the capsule, and got with 8 miles of the moon, and then went back. So they did everything but land on the moon. The night before Apollo 10 launched into space, Gene got a little stir crazy. They keep him at a place out there at the Kennedy Space Station on the beach, and Gene said, I'm going nuts. This is the night before the launch. He said, I got to get out of here. And he said, I want to go see my wife and daughter. And they said, well, go ahead. You can take the car, which is probably a Corvette. You can take the car, but don't get caught. Because if you get caught, there's going to be repercussions. Well, I don't imagine Gene Cernan was following the speed limit that night. He was going very fast, and he was coming back to the place where he was supposed to be staying from seeing his wife and daughter. And he got pulled over. A cop put the lights on, And there was Gene Cernan pulled over on the side of the road. It was right by they could see the rocket from where they were. And the cop came up to the car and said, well, sir, you're going pretty fast. Can I see your license? I don't have a license with me. Can I see the records for this car? It's a rental car. It belongs to NASA. I don't have those with me. I see. Well, can you identify yourself? And he said, well, he said, I'm actually, you see that rocket over there? I'm supposed to be on that thing tomorrow morning and fly to space. And of course, the cop believed that, like any other story he would have heard. And it just so happened that a NASA official who had identification on him happened by and saw Gene being pulled over by a cop, got out of the car and understood Gene, what he was doing. And he said to the cop, no, here's my identification, my photos, photo identifications. This man is supposed to fly to the moon tomorrow. And we can't be arresting him because they were about to take him into headquarters and arrest him because they didn't know what else to do with him. And Gene was seeing headlines in the papers, Moon Man arrested, mission canceled. Anyway, so the officer finally said, I've heard a lot of cock and bull stories in my life. And if you think I'm going to believe that one, you are crazy. Thousands of people around here, and I'm supposed to believe I caught me an astronaut on the way to the moon. But it's such a good story. Get out of here and go to the moon. So Gene went back there and he got away with it. I'm going to close just with two things. I promised to talk a little bit about their faith, which to me was interesting because these two guys were very good friends and were very close. They had very different philosophies. And Gene and I, my wife, I'll do this quick as I can, went to Israel in 2015. And we had as you always have to have an Israeli guide with you, as well as your own personal pastor. And the Israeli guide who had converted to Christianity, we were at the old temple. He was walking up and down in front of the group of people on our tour. And he was saying, this is where Jesus overturned the money tables and did all these things. And he said, after hearing that talk, Neil came to Israel right after the moon landing. And they told him this thing about this is where Jesus, and Neil said, you mean I am standing where Jesus walked and did all these things? And the guy said, yes. And they said, well, Neil said, I'm more moved at this moment than I was when I stood in the face of the moon. Well, the tour guide we had was very nice. I liked him. So when it was over, when I could see him aside, I took him aside and said, who told you that? And he said, it's something they tell us, at our tourist headquarters. And I said, do you know what Purdue University is? He said, no. I said, well, it has a lot of astronauts. Neil went there. I knew Neil Armstrong. Neil Armstrong didn't say that. He did not say that. First of all, Neil Armstrong would never talk about his faith in that way to people he didn't know extremely, extremely well. Second of all, Neil Armstrong was not a Christian in the sense he didn't, his beliefs were not in Jesus and in everything in the Bible. Neil, at one point in his life, he was asked when he was going to be a Boy Scout leader what his faith was. He said he was a deist at that time, oriented towards scientific fact and natural observation rather than scripture. At times he sounded a little bit like an agnostic, but he definitely was not a Christian by the sense of the word we define it as. And I decided to go research how this happened, how this story happened. And I found out when Neil died in 2012, a very conservative group pumping stuff onto the internet wrote and said that, Neil Armstrong died, but, in all the words, all thousands of words written about him in the New York Times and the Washington Post, those are the papers they named, you didn't see one thing about him and what a strong Christian he was and how strong his faith was in his life. And so it was actually a group that was attacking the New York Times and the Washington Post, but it created this story, which just wasn't true. Neil just wouldn't talk about things like that, and definitely was more of a deist than a Christian or and an agnostic. Gene Cernan was a Catholic and a very very strong in his faith. And this is what he answered me when I asked him what it was like to walk on the moon. He said, one of the first things you see when you're out of the spacecraft is the Earth in all its beauty and splendor. The blues of the ocean and the whites of the snow and the clouds. It's a three-dimensional out there and all that blackness. All the way down in our ascent, not only was I looking at where we were going to land and the radar and listening, I wanted to look at the Earth. You just wanted to freeze the lander and stand there and look at it. It was in a little triangular window to the side of him. But you didn't have time. I didn't feel closer to God on the moon. You can feel close to God any place. But certainly, I was witness to a small part of his creation. There's no question in my mind about that at all. I was in a place in time and space where science met its match. There were things I saw in terms of the purpose and logicality of the Earth as it moved through space. It didn't tumble. Its overpowering beauty. The fact that I could literally look alongside the edge and there was this blackness in which the Earth was three-dimensional. You could put your hand around the Earth and almost focus on the endlessness of time, the endlessness of infinity. Can I show it to you? No. Can I draw you a picture of it? No. But I can tell you it exists because I saw it with my own eyes. Gene was a very strong believer in return to the moon. He always asked not to be called the last man on the moon. He said, I'm the most recent person on the moon, not the last. And then he named his book, The Last Man. But I always think the publisher did that. But he talked about the fact that we need to educate children. We need to teach children today, and they will take us into the next steps in the space race. And that's what's happening now. So I'm sorry I've gone a little bit over, but I'll stop there. And are there any questions?
Well, I want to thank you very much for this. That was excellent.
They were interesting people. They were interesting people. And don't believe it when anybody tells you Neil was aloof. He was not aloof. He was fun loving. He once told me he played 10 instruments. You know, he played the piano, the banjo, or the ukulele. He played several kinds of horns. When the astronauts had parties or the test pilots, he was at the piano playing music and they were all singing. He was a fun guy. He just didn't want to talk about, everybody wanted to ask him, what was it like to land on the moon? Well, there's more to his life than that. And so he didn't want to answer that question all the time, over and over. But he was a very friendly guy, a funny guy, and just it was a wonderful experience to know him.
Did you ever get Neil's autograph?
Neil signed autographs for quite a while. I have 5 of them. But he discovered, in close to the 2000, that his autographs was selling for $2,000, $5,000 and more on the internet. And what people would do is these autograph people would get a hold of a child and send a child to him to get the autograph. The autograph would go back to the person who was selling them, and he'd sell them online for thousands of dollars. And Neil said, no more of that nonsense. No autographs. And believe me, he signed no more autographs. When Neil said no more, he meant no more. He caught his barber selling his hair. His barber had been cutting his hair for years and years, and he found out his barber was selling his hair. Oh. And he sued the barber. It was settled out of case, and he gave the money to Purdue. Purdue, by the way, owns the rights to it. That's one small step for man, because Neil gave it to him when he died. So when you see that used, that actually belonged to Neil. It now belongs to Purdue University.
Okay, well, I want to thank you again, and Steve and Susan, for having gotten this program. I'm really appreciative.
Thank you, John.
Very quickly, the next week is the animal rights group. It's a Zoom from somewhere in the East Coast. Please check your week at a glance from Sherry, and it'll give you the details on that. And we hope to see you back for that. So with that, I think we're done.
Thank you. Thanks for asking me.
Thank you, John.
Take care, everybody.